Greetings and welcome to this first of two online forums on the topic of liturgy in the time of the pandemic. My name is Bob Hurto, and I am the director of the Center for Religion and Spirituality at Loyola Marymount University. The center offers continuing education in religion, spirituality, and theology in English and Spanish, and online and in class. As we begin, I want to offer just a few words on our vision for these online forums. In this forum, we are not adjudicating liturgical practice. In the Catholic Church, that role belongs universally to the Pope and to each bishop in his diocese. The purpose of this forum is to be a sounding board for reflection on liturgical practice during the pandemic and an exploration of possible ways to fine-tune practice. There is not a single right way for a Catholic worshiping community to carry on during a pandemic, but by engaging a public health expert and a liturgist in this forum, we're trying to give parish and diocesan leaders the tools for prayerful discernment. Parishes have to make very difficult decisions right now. For example, dioceses and parishes have made decisions to reopen, but concern for the virus persists and members of parishes are not all coming back yet. This leads to many questions in regard to discerning the best way forward under the extreme conditions of the pandemic. It is a time of uncertainty for bishops and the faithful, and especially for those who have liturgical ministry responsibilities. We hope to mitigate the uncertainty by providing up-to-date information on public health risks in relation to Catholic liturgical practice. Two housekeeping items. First, if you have a Facebook account, you will be able to write your questions for our panelists in the comment section. I will be forwarding your questions to the moderator. If the panelist response does not address your question, please resubmit it with the clarification that you seek. Second, here are three ground rules that we are observing in these two forums. Current liturgical norms differ in each diocese and by location due to the current spread of the virus in that region. These practices are evolving, so the forum is meant to help inspire ways to fine-tune your own practice. Your local diocesan office of worship is the arbiter of evolving ideas, so we encourage you to work with them. Second, we are not debating the issues of religious liberties and governmental control of religious practice in this forum. The forum will examine a set of practices collected from different regions and review them in light of public health concerns and the impact that they have on current liturgical principles. The innovative spirit is commendable, so do not take these comments as a critique of bad planning, but as ways to fine-tune your own practices. We have posted these ground rules in the comment section, along with a few general rules of netiquette that will govern our time together. In order to create a climate of respect, we ask that in your comments you be mindful of these rules. Without further ado, I turn things over to our moderator, Father Gilbert Sunghera of the Society of Jesus. Father Sungara will introduce our two panelists. Father Sungara is Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Detroit Mercy, and his research interests are liturgical and sacred spaces. Prior to joining the Society of Jesus, he completed his Master in Architecture from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and worked as a designer. As a Jesuit, he continued his study on the relationship between religion and architecture at Yale University, earning a Master of Sacred Theology. In addition to his faculty duties at the School of Architecture at the University of Detroit Mercy, Father Sungara leads the award-winning National Liturgical Space Consulting Service. Welcome, Father Sungara.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be your moderator for today's session. Again, I'm serving just as moderator, and we have two distinguished panelists, and each of them will be speaking from their own perspectives. The first is Michael Rozier, who's an assistant professor of health management and policy in the College of Public Health and Social Justice at St. Louis University. He's also a Jesuit. His undergraduate degree is in chemistry from SLU and a master's of health sciences from Johns Hopkins University and a Ph.D. from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in health management and policy. His research interests are in public health ethics, organizational ethics, community benefits, policy framing, population health strategies, community health partnerships.
St. Louis University.
But these last few months, he probably has had his greatest challenge helping steer Jesuit communities who are creating protocols for living in communities, a job that's not for the faint of heart. As a priest, he also has a great insight into the presider's role at Liturgy. Johann Von Paris is a native of Belgium, is the director of liturgy and the sacred arts since 1995 at the Basilica of St. Mary in Minneapolis. He holds a graduate degree in art history and comparative religious studies from the Catholic University at Louvain in Belgium, and a Ph.D. in theology from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. He has authored several books and articles in the field of liturgy and art, and has taught at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, and St. Thomas University in the Twin Cities. Johan has steered the Basilica's growth as a national leader in liturgical practice from a parish that's in a neighborhood in transition on the edge of the central business district of Minneapolis. So to Johan and Michael, welcome and thank you for being part of this effort. Again, to help parishes think through creatively as they evolve in their practice. So I'll turn it over first to Michael if he has some just opening comments.
Thank you, Gilbert. And Johan, very good to be with you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just to kind of frame this from a public health perspective, I think it's helpful to recognize where we were and where we are in terms of the science of this particular infectious disease and how it might impact the way that we proceed as a faith community. So, you know, the big shutdown that happened in the United States in March was essentially to buy us time in terms of preparing our hospitals to meet the capacity, but then also that we could gain knowledge of how this thing is transmitted, who it affects, how it affects them. And so some things that matter to us as faith communities, we now know that the severity of the disease does not hit people equally. So we know elderly, we know men, we know people with underlying conditions like cardiac conditions and diabetes and other conditions are most at risk for very severe disease. So that is likely going to impact some of the decisions that we would be making. We also know, which we did not know early on, that it can be transmitted fairly effectively in pre-symptomatic individuals. And so that means people who are infected with the disease, who are positive with COVID, but have yet not displayed symptoms themselves. And that can be up to about a 12-day window where people can be infectious and transmitting the disease and have no sense that they're infected themselves. So that is a really important learning that shapes how we behave. Parallel to that, we know that masks are an effective mitigation factor. You might remember early on we were advised not to wear masks. That was also to help our hospital, our healthcare workers tamp down the supply that they absolutely needed, but also because we weren't fully aware that people would be pre-symptomatic and infectious for so long. And so now we really wear a mask as a mitigating factor to make sure that we're not transmitting the disease to other people. We also know that transmission is far more effective indoors than it is outdoors. And this is a characteristic of this particular virus that we did not know early on. And so that absolutely shapes our behaviors and some of the public policies that you're seeing, because now we have plenty of case studies that show the effectiveness of indoor transmission and the fact that it does not get transmitted very easily outdoors. So all of those things, I think, are really important scientific criteria to take into this conversation. In addition, we see cycles of the disease. And so we need to be prepared for when the community transmission is low. We might behave differently than when the community transmission is high. And we know that we will cycle through this until we have an effective therapeutic or vaccine. So those are kind of my opening comments, in addition to the fact that I think it's really important to pay attention to the fact that we all have really holy and good desires at this time, and we're just trying to work through how do we live out those desires in a way that are true to ourselves as individuals and as communities of faith. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Michael. And just a reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the comments section if you're following on Facebook, and we'll get to as many as we can during this session, and then we'll also pick up any questions that we're not able to address now at the second session, which will be the following Wednesday. So now I turn it over to Johan to maybe talk a little bit about the shifting understandings of liturgy, especially how this pandemic is revealing itself at this time.
Thanks, Gilbert. Well, I sort of marvel at the fact that we have been thrown into this experience rather quickly and unexpectedly. And as you know, liturgists, change is not coming very easily. We like to take our time, centuries sometimes, but here we have to deal with these with this fact of the pandemic and make changes rapidly and continue to make changes as our understanding of the pandemic keeps changing and as the pandemic itself keeps changing. Now, unlike with most everything else that we do in the Catholic Church, there is no handbook that spells out exactly what we are to do, though, of course, national and local authorities, Catholic authorities, have provided us with some guidelines. Early on, I was reminded of a conference I attended. It must have been in, I think, 1992 or 93, that was hosted by IFRA, Interfaith Forum on Religion, Art, and Architecture. And the topic actually was worship in a digital age. Now, this was at the very beginning of the digital age, obviously. Now, as we were starting to talk about this, I had this vision of people watching Mass on TV, sitting in their comfortable couch, wearing pajamas and slippers and sipping their coffee and petting their cat while they were doing this. And so I was absolutely not convinced that this was a helpful way of worshiping. And many questions that were raised at the time are still very pressing today. You know, one very important theological truth is that when we gather for worship, Christ is present in the word proclaimed, in the celebrant, of course, above all in the Eucharistic species, but also in the gathered community. Now, what happens if the gathered community is scattered? How is Christ present in a scattered community? Secondly, how can people participate in a full, active, and conscious manner as is required by Sacrosanctum Concilium, while they're sitting in their living room, you know, on their couch, in their slippers, sipping coffee? Also, the liturgy uses all the senses that God has given us to draw us into the celebration. And when we're sitting on our couch, several of the senses we are deprived of. Somebody raised the question about real presence. The conversation was about adoration, virtual adoration. You know, how are we thinking about virtual real presence? Is there a theology for that? Lighting candles, you know, we love to light candles. And I'm a little disappointed when I go to some churches in Europe where you don't have real candles, but you drop a coin in an electronic machine and this electronic candle comes on. But now we are even one step removed and we light a virtual candle, money goes somewhere, and then somewhere a candle is lit, but the physicality of it has completely disappeared. What about the requirements of worship in a sacred space whenever possible? You know, there are opportunities given that we can worship elsewhere if need be. The question was raised, can there be a virtual sacred space? In many circumstances today, we worship outside. Is outdoors sacred space? You know, and a question that is very pressing, I think, is how long can we survive on spiritual communion rather than physical communion? So it seems that virtual worship that we have been thrown into, and even worship with a few people present under very restrictive norms, is somewhat counterintuitive to our Catholic experience and to how liturgy has worked and is supposed to work for us Catholics. You know, we want to be together. It feels unnatural not to be together. And even when you go to worship, when it's now allowed, you're made to sit 6 feet apart. Pews are are cordoned off, and there's this distance that we're not used to. We want to join our voices in song, and now we are told not to, even when wearing a mask. We want to walk around in processions, and now we have to stay put in our pews. We want to dip our fingers in holy water fonts, and our fonts are empty. We want to smell incense, at least many of us want to. We want to light candles and visit our beloved shrines, and we cannot. We want to interact with the rich symbols of our liturgy. We want to hug and embrace one another, and we may not. And above all, we yearn to receive Holy Communion, but oftentimes we are not able to do so, or at an unusual place in the liturgy. I, for one, have taken some great consolation in the rich theological truth that whenever we gather for worship, we gather with the entire body of Christ. When we worship with those who are present in church, those who are living anywhere in the world, and even those who have gone before us. So in a certain sense, we always gather with those physically present and those who are spiritually present. May we say virtually present? Of course, this is not the first time in our history that we have been made to worship under these circumstances or not worship. Think of times of religious persecution and war and previous pandemics. Now, unlike in these earlier days, we have been given the great gift of virtual worship, for better or for worse. And with this, I would like to end my introductory words.
Thank you, Johan. That was wonderful, and it covers a lot of the kind of topic areas I think we want to be able to have conversation on. And again, if you do have questions, go ahead and submit them to the comment sections. The other thing is in the introduction or the advertising for this, we indicated that we would be focusing on indoor mass at this session and outdoor mass on the second. But because of the current condition in California that's requiring everyone to do outdoor liturgies, we're going to mix them both in both sections just to help with that. So what I'd like to do is to begin showing some images and some videos from different places that begin to explain a little bit about what's going on, so we have some common reference for all of us as we begin discussing this. So just give me a minute while I load this properly. And the first one that we'll begin with is actually a typical kind of preparatory video that most parishes have put out to explain the process. This one comes from the Basilica of St. Mary in Minneapolis and talks about the traditional kind of protocols that most of us are familiar with. And then I'll open it back up to the panelists to see what they're noticing from both public health and also from liturgical matters.
These are the protocols all attendees are required to follow while on the Basilica campus. Please arrive early to allow time to go through the check-in and health screening process. This may take 5 to 10 minutes. Church doors will open 20 minutes before Mass. You will be entering the East Church doors. This is a step-free entrance. Guests will not be allowed to enter after Mass has started. Your first stop will be the check-in tent. Staff will confirm your pre-registration. They will take your temperature with a no-touch temporal thermometer, and they'll ask you some simple health screening questions. As you enter the church, please sanitize your hands and remember to wear your face mask throughout Mass. Also, sanitize your hands before and after you receive Eucharist.
During this time, we will be distributing Holy Communion after Mass ends. The person distributing Holy Communion will be standing exactly where I am standing. They will sanitize their hands and they will be wearing their masks. People receiving Holy Communion will approach the communion station through the center aisle. We will distribute communion starting with the people who are sitting in the center sections, and when they have received Holy Communion, the people sitting in the outer sections will use the secondary aisles Walk all the way to the baptismal font and then use the center aisle to come forward. When you come up for Holy Communion, please observe social distancing by using the markers that are on the floor in the Basilica. As you approach Holy Communion, there will be a station where you can sanitize your hands, so please do that. At all times, wear your mask. When you come forward to receive Holy Communion, please extend your arms as far as possible toward the person distributing Holy Communion. Holy Communion must be received in the hand at this time. When you have received Holy Communion, please step to the side, lower your mask, and then receive Holy Communion. There will be a sanitizing station where you can sanitize your hands on your way out of the church. After receiving Holy Communion, we ask that you leave the church immediately, either by the St. Anthony door where you entered, or you may also use the door by the Mary Garden, the St. Anne door. As you are making your way out, we ask that you do not light candles or any other devotions. Also, please refrain from touching anything on your way out. We will sanitize the places where you've sat, as well as the doors that you have used. Guests will be assigned to a designated seat in the church. A staff person will direct you to that seat. People living in the same household will be allowed to sit together. Guests may only sit in their assigned seat to maintain social distancing. Public restrooms are limited, so please plan accordingly.
If you feel unable to adhere to these protocols, I'd ask you to please reconsider registering to attend Mass. To pre-register to attend Mass, you can do that on our website the day before the Mass you wish to attend. Or if you don't have computer access or computer skills, you can call 612-317-3417. We believe the actions that we are taking are prudent and are at the very heart of our mission to seek the well-being of the city and our community. I thank you in advance for your commitment to safety and for the common good.
So again, this is a typical type of an introduction that many of us have heard, and I'll just make a few opening comments. I did appreciate the humor in this. It's kind of dark times for most of us, and though I have to admit, seeing some of those airline photos scared the heck out of me. I can't imagine even going on a plane at this point. So it does help with the recognition that this is a bit of a dangerous undertaking in some respects, coming to Mass in a church. So I'll leave it at that and just kind of open it up to either Michael or Johan for any just thoughts that you were noticing. Maybe Michael?
Yeah, well, since Johan was instrumental in putting it together, I'm sure. Some of the commendable things that I notice is the very clear communication, both verbal communication, but then also having visual communications like maps and flow charts that show how you're moving throughout a space. Those kind of communication strategies are particularly helpful at this time. Another kind of subtle communication is the way that they put the markings down the aisle in terms of the distancing required for receiving Holy Communion. And what I like about it is it is a clear marking that people don't need to kind of think about, oh, am I 5 feet, 7 feet, 8, how far is 6 feet? Like, you just give them resources they need so that they can actually pray while they're going through this, because that's the thing, like, all of these things should be oriented to help people pray while they are in this space. And if they're not trying to think through, am I far enough back? That gives them the ability to pray through their time. And what I love about that is they used kind of I'm guessing it's the seal of the Basilica or the seal of the Archbishop. I'm not sure what it is. But, anytime you can do something like that, rather than like a big red dot or a big like police line, do not cross to tape off cues, that, those can be visually distracting in ways that I think are unnecessary. And the other kind of thing that I would raise up that I don't know the space, but you could tell how often they referenced the resources that were available. So the sanitation stations, I'm sure people don't need to search for them. They are right there exactly where they need them. And so you want to build the physical space, again, so that there are very few decisions that people are having to make or trying to search out while they are in this moment. And having masks, stations, sanitation stations just readily available really helps achieve both the public health goal and I think the spiritual task that we are all about.
Thank you. And Johan?
So, Michael, indeed, it is the Basilica's coat of arms, because as a Basilica, we have the right to have a coat of arms. And we had a conversation about how are we marking this with one of those, with a red marker or something. And we thought it would be better to have our coat of arms. And by the way, it's not only on the inside, but also outside, leading from the parking lot all the way to the entrance are these distance markers. So one of our goals was to take the burden off the people, so that we make sure that everybody is safe and they don't have to worry about it. We guide them through everything. Now, from a liturgical point of view, and of course nobody asked me for my opinion, but I'm going to give it nonetheless. There's so many things that we're asked to do which 6 months ago we would have frowned upon severely. Having communion at the end of Mass and not in its proper place within the Mass, everything leading up to it, or asking people to leave as soon as they receive Holy Communion. It's totally frowned upon just 6 months ago. When people walk out, it's like, not allowing people to engage in devotional activities after or at the end of Mass is also so counterintuitive to who we are. But nonetheless, since we are not decision makers, we are implementers. And we take what we are given and try to make it as good as possible.
So Johan, this came as a question, actually, that location of putting communion at the end. Is that a directive of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis?
It is indeed. So it's both in national directives from the USCCB as well as the Archbishop's directive.
Oh, okay. Because I know in San Diego, and I've got an image that'll be coming up on that, and then, but I know here in Detroit, for example, I don't think they've been given that directive, which again, it's difficult because you then have people moving around. Let me just show you. I'm going to go back to these images for a second. So this is the cathedral in Los Angeles. And I have to admit, as a presider, when I look out, now that's way more people than I've seen at I've only done one Mass in the post-pandemic world, but it's so strange seeing people so scattered and trying to build some sense of community. Now, luckily, the cathedral's large, so they can fit people in, but it does seem a little strange. Oops, just one second. The next image. This was an interesting idea that came up for Palm Sunday at St. Peter's, using the palm branches as a way to kind of fill in for places. I know I've seen images of people putting photographs of parishioners in pews as a way of filling in the space, which might be another way of blocking certain places where you don't want people to sit. Or moving chairs. Now, this is a plaza, an outdoor Mass. And I kind of wonder if that is another way of doing it, but I have to admit we've just done this in our university chapel, and it feels so strange because it doesn't offer a sense of community. It feels like everyone's there for private prayer, private worship. I believe I have one other image before we go into, again, another outdoor scenario where they have to cover everything with a tent just to keep the heat away from the people, and how that, at least from an architectural standpoint, is really distracting and problematic. Now, Johan, I don't know, have you started yet on weekend liturgies, or is this weekend the first one for you at Minneapolis?
At the moment, we're not opening weekend liturgy to the congregation yet. We have started inviting a small number of people to come to our weekday Mass, but we have not started Sunday Masses yet. But the experience of distance is, I think, as you mentioned, Gilbert, it's a very strange experience, because in large spaces like Los Angeles Cathedral, but we're not as large, but we're a fairly large church. By distancing people, you create this extra space between the celebrant and the congregation. Even, the lector, you're proclaiming to people who are sitting far, far away, and there is not this connectivity that liturgy really requires. So it's an added difficulty to celebrating the liturgy well, I think. And when you have the hybrid liturgies where some people are present, but most everybody is virtually present, you have to figure out a way to make sure that the people who are present in church are included, but also you need to create connection with the people who are virtually present. So it's an added difficulty, I think.
On that last point, I know as a faculty member, we're going through this. Trying to teach online is so different than teaching face-to-face, and that whole struggle of figuring out how you might do what's called asynchronous, where you're teaching for maybe half the class that's in your space and then the other half that's online, and trying to figure out a good medium where the two can work is really a bit crazy, I would say. I don't know, Michael, if you've had some experience yet on that.
My only experience is trying to think through the fall classes, all of which will be hybrid. Right. So it'll be both in person and synchronous online, and it is not the easiest pedagogical method, to be sure. And while I very much appreciate the concerns about the distance, when I looked at the outdoor seating that you showed, it was all single chairs. And I was like, okay, well, what happens when families or couples, or how I'm guessing they have pods set up elsewhere so that, I think arranging the outdoor seats would be important so that people coming from the same household, as we saw in the Basilica video, are able to sit together. Which allows just a little bit of connectivity.
And I would imagine Go ahead, Johan.
So the pre-registration that we require actually allows us to create a map of the church layout for every liturgy, and then we can distance everybody accordingly. Have families sit together, but create enough distance from the other people. So that's the thing we do before every liturgy. Also, we have had weddings and funerals, and for weddings, we assign people to certain pews, which assists with keeping all these norms together.
Okay. And actually, let me raise this, especially with you, Michael. A lot of the charts that I've seen about the level of danger, let's say, different events have, weddings and funerals are more dangerous than a normal Mass in a lot of these. What's the thinking behind that?
I think it's simply because it is much more challenging to maintain social distancing outside of the worship itself. Yeah. And so people are coming and going, greeting, it's just a very kind of convivial, or, for a wedding, or, you want to kind of console each other during a funeral. And so it's nothing about, I think, the liturgy itself, and more kind of the personal dimension of those kind of liturgies.
That makes sense. Yes, Johan.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And for that reason, when we have funerals, we have limited attendance to the immediate family. So people who, I'm thinking of one funeral, for instance, and the person had actually been in hospice in the home of one of his daughters, and the immediate family had been constantly waking with him. So they had been together for 2 months. So the people who were there were the ones who were at the funeral, but no additional people, so as to avoid all this possible interaction that, as Michael says, is much more needed when it comes to a funeral.
I know
and that kind of distinction, Gilbert, I think is important because it recognizes the human nature in all of us. Like a robot could look at a Sunday liturgy, a wedding, and a funeral and say, these are all the same, let's treat them the same. But we know our human nature is different, and we need to pay attention to that in everything that we're doing, kind of knowing our own selves as social creatures.
No, I definitely agree. It's interesting here in Detroit early on, funerals were limited to 10 people at most, but then they went down to 5. And there was a funeral of an old-time parishioner whose children were actually quite famous in different arenas. And even the priest wasn't allowed to be at the funeral. So it was more of a recognition. So the priest waited at the cemetery, and as the hearse went by, blessed it with holy water as it drove by, just as a sign that the church was with them somehow. But now I think things have eased up a little bit more, but it is interesting. I just wanted to show this one image of the outdoor. And it seems like, especially outdoors, people are less worried about distancing. And you can see where the markers are on the floor, but no one's really paying attention to it. Is that something that we should be careful about, Michael?
There's something in terms of distancing?
Yeah, when you're outdoors.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as I mentioned in kind of my opening remarks, outdoors is a much better situation in terms of transmission than indoors. But, and this is another thing in terms of just socializing people and getting, because we are not going to be at this for another couple of weeks or just another couple of months. We are going to be at this perhaps for another year or more. I know people hate to hear that, but that is just the truth. And so whether you're indoors or outdoors, I think it is good to try to kind of get people into the same rhythm, the same behaviors, even if it might be slightly less risky.
That's a good point. I'm going to move on to, again, communion. Now, this one's in Germany, so from a U.S. standpoint, it's probably not as fearful, but you could tell even in there's a lot of crowding. And there was a question that came in earlier about this problem where people just aren't distancing themselves, even with ushers in the place. But you can see how people are kind of grouping together because, again, it's almost a habit, of communion.
Yeah.
And any
thoughts
course, that way?
Within Europe, when I moved to the United States, I marveled at the orderly fashion in which Catholics actually process up for Holy Communion.
Yes.
In Europe, the experience is it's a free-for-all. Everybody just en masse goes to communion. Here, I think there's already built in a sort of orderliness in terms of processing up to receive Holy Communion. They don't have that in Germany. But we only have one person distributing Holy Communion, and we have not 2 lines coming up, but 1 line coming up. So you don't have what you see in this particular photo happening at all.
I'm going to switch to another video. Again, this is another traditional one with the person actually being the dispenser, because now they have to spray. Some places don't have the gels and stuff. And does this make sense? It's funny, we're doing liturgies in our community, and if I'm distributing the communion in our community, I'll sanitize my hands, but the other people aren't. And I'm just wondering, is this overkill?
Yeah, so my opinion of this is that it probably does very little to stop the transmission of the disease for a couple reasons. First, you actually need, we imagine hand sanitizer working immediately. As soon as I'm done rubbing my hands and spreading it around, then poof, it's magically done. Actually, it needs a little bit of time to set in and to appropriately kill the germs that are on our hands. So the idea of spraying somebody and within 10 seconds walking up to receiving, it just has not had time to do the job that a hand sanitizer is meant to do, number one. Number two, I would hope that that person actually isn't in contact with the person communicating. So if their hands are touching, or if then something has gone wrong. And so perhaps this is done because they've had experiences of people not being able to hold their hands still. I don't know what would motivate this particular action.
I do know from just even doing communion here, sometimes it is, as much as you try to drop the host into the hand, especially if they're elderly, there's a tendency to want to reach out and touch. And then it's just like, oh my God, now now we're kind of a family unit, so I'm not as worried, but I can imagine that's a struggle in a lot of places. Johan. Yeah,
I have two additional questions with regard to this particular image, and it pertains to both the deacon and the recipient of Holy Communion. It seems like both of them fall within the age risk category.
Yes.
Of course, I mean, we discourage people who fall in a risk category from attending. Of course, if somebody registers and comes, we will not have the age police at the door. We have a Swiss Guard, but they're gentle Swiss Guards. But we do also have the policy for whoever distributes Holy Communion that they are 60 or younger. So all of our priests actually are above 65. So none of them will distribute Holy Communion after Mass.
It's interesting. That's the same protocol we're following in our community, because especially religious order communities, we have 20 Jesuits and 19 of them are considered vulnerable because of pre-existing conditions or age. And that same policy is so at our downtown parish, the priest doesn't leave the sanctuary at all and doesn't even process in for that reason, to just distance himself from it. And younger Eucharistic ministers have been involved. I'm going to show, again, this is a video from San Diego, and this follows the same practice of communion after the priest leaves at the end of Mass, but they're using plexiglass shields. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but there's two stands on each side of the altar, and there's a plexiglass that protects the person distributing, and the person receiving actually puts their hand in a small slot at the bottom of that plexiglass to receive communion. So, and you'll see it now as they're moving into place. Each minister is using the hand sanitizer. Now, in the Diocese of San Diego, I believe the bishop has restricted any communion by tongue. And I know that's a controversial move. A number of folks have been really resistant on it, but it is a problem as a priest when you have to deal with that scenario. But I'm just wondering if you have any comments about the use of plexiglass as a shield. It's being used in a lot of different places and different scenarios, from checkout stands at grocery stores. And does it help, or?
My opinion is that it probably helps on the margins. That it is not going to be the thing that masks are going to be far more effective than plexiglass. So I would not substitute plexiglass for mask. If you have a choice of one or the other, definitely choose masks. But if you want to have some kind of an extra layer of precaution, that is probably not a bad idea. But if you're using masks consistently and well, it is likely not, absolutely necessary to include something.
And Johan, from a liturgical perspective, having that thing in between, is that good or not?
So I think this entire exercise is trying to find balance between good liturgical practice, but also good healthcare practice. Yeah. And sometimes we need to make accommodations and, reach across the aisle and work together on things. Am I seeing a new liturgical accoutrement being born? I hope not. But if it is helpful for now, maybe it works. But if Michael says that it's only marginally helpful, then I would probably, I will not encourage this to be adopted in our location.
Yeah.
Now,
Go ahead.
I had some, with regards to communion on the hand versus on the tongue. So we really discourage people from receiving Holy Communion on the tongue for the time being. Now, if somebody presents themselves to receive Holy Communion on the tongue, again, we will not have communion police wrestling them down to receive on the hand, but we do have, right, but we will stop, and the priest necessarily has to sanitize his hands, and then wait, what is it, Michael, 20 seconds till it takes effect? So, and some people see it as a shaming act, but it's not. It's a very practical act, which needs to be done, I think.
No, I agree. As a priest, it's really a bit problematic because it does slow things down. I was at a drive-in mass, and we'll be showing a video of that in shortly. And it was very interesting. They basically bring communion to the cars. And they indicated if you wanted to receive in another manner, then you'll have to wait until after the liturgy to receive, which I thought was a way to accommodate folks who just felt that they couldn't receive in the hand. But it was very interesting. That whole practice of the car could be more problematic too. Let me just go ahead.
I saw a video this week. It's a group of seminarians are demonstrating if you're going to receive on the tongue, how to receive on the tongue and how not to receive on the tongue.
Really?
So that might be interesting to watch.
Well, yes, we'll have to get that for our next session. One of the questions that came in was asking about taking communion actually into the congregation. And this is a practice we're using at our church in downtown Detroit. So let me just show you this video. And the Eucharistic minister moves and crosses back and forth on the aisle. And part of the reason here is because the aisle isn't wide enough for people to be separated 6 feet from anyone else if they're coming down the center aisle. And then they begin, they have to wait until the minister leaves to remove their mask and consume. So any thoughts on that? I'm going to do the stop sharing for a minute so we can see if there's other questions that have come up. But any concerns, Michael? I know you had a few earlier when we were looking at this.
Yeah, and so my concern is primarily about how long it takes people to learn new behaviors and how many decisions people are making along the way. Because in public health, what we want to do is to minimize the number of actions, motions, decisions that people need to make in order to stay safe. And so I guess it depends in my mind how well people are able to process up. So I think we had some comment about even with signage and markings that a parish was really struggling to get people to follow the procedures as they were in the procession for communion. So if it's a parish that is really struggling to make that work coming up for communion, then maybe this is a good idea. But one of the things that worries me about that kind of communion is that when it's just one person on the edge of the aisle, it's pretty straightforward. But as you see, there were a lot of couples there, or you could imagine families of 3 or 4 sitting in a pew. And so then what happens when that communion minister is leaning over several people or trying to shuffle through a pew to get down to that fourth person? Then suddenly there's just a lot of decision making that needs to go on. And every time you do that, there's another risk of a mistake getting made. And so the reason that I like the procession up toward communion, if you can pull it off, it's that there are many fewer decisions and fewer chances of making those kind of mistakes. But it's not to say that one is perfect and the other one is ought to be avoided. And people need to figure out how best to make this work, but to do it and to watch for those decision-making points and to help people through them as best as possible.
Is there a concern about when you don't have wide aisles, how much, when a priest is moving down or the ministers are moving down that aisle and people are within 2 to 3 feet of the presider, now everyone's wearing a mask, is that movement of concern for both the ministers and the congregants?
So as long as they're not removing their masks before speaking, and as long as they are properly distanced within the pew to begin with, it shouldn't be that big of a concern. But it's also why I like, as Johan noted, that if you're going to do a procession, to have a single procession, unless your center aisle is large enough, or as the communion minister is moving along, if you're going to do communion that way, then you don't want to seat people, people in rows 1 on the left and right. You want to seat them in rows 1 and 5 maybe, and 3 and 7, so that there's this additional staggering down the center aisle.
Okay, good. Johan, any thoughts on that type of taking communion into the congregation?
From a liturgical point of view, the procession to receive Holy Communion is an act of commitment. It's an active activity, engaging in. Being a pure recipient without having to make this act of commitment makes it very different. Now, it's from a liturgical point of view. Now, what I like is that they probably did it at the time of communion in the normal sequence of the Mass. Now, from a health point of view, I think when you do it at the end of Mass, and it's a way for people to leave, they don't have to go back to their pew. It's a very clear departure without any contact. So
it's positive, negatives to it.
Gilbert,
Michael?
I see a question has been posted about the hand sanitizer, just to kind of clarify a previous comment that I made. So somebody says, I hear that it's 20 seconds for the sanitizer to take effect. From what I understand, now this is not me giving medical advice, so please, don't sue me. But the 20 seconds for the hand sanitizer is the parallel to the 20 seconds with soap, washing your hands with soap. So the 20 seconds is that you should actually be agitating for 20 seconds. And then it actually takes several more minutes for the hand sanitizer to be effective. And so even if you did it kind of at the back of the church and by the time they got there, so if it took several minutes for them to get there, then that's fine. But the 20 seconds that the CDC recommends is for the agitation itself and not for the effectiveness of the hand sanitizer. That's several minutes. Just wanted to clarify that, as long as the question was there.
Right. And actually, along those lines, it seems like there's been a stress that it's moving away from contact, catching the infection by contact versus by breathing in. And so is that the need for all of this kind of hand sanitizers and stuff still is critical?
And yes, I think so. So it does transmit on surfaces much less than we had originally kind of thought that it did. But it still can transmit in that way. And so as long as the resources are available and they're not overly intrusive, and then we should absolutely, I think, be taking those kind of precautions.
And the same thing with cleaning all the pews, sanitizing it in between services for that same reason, that someone could be asymptomatic and
and yes, and it's a tricky distinction, but the pre-symptomatic people are the ones we're more worried about than the asymptomatic people. But yes, people could not be experiencing symptoms and could be transmitting the virus.
Okay, gotcha. And just a comment there was a question coming in about different seating arrangements where it's not that clear how they're going to move people around, and then the priest is taking communion back out. Again, I think what you have to do is adapt to your condition. You have to figure out how you're going to do it. I know in our chapel, for example, we took it down from 120 chairs down to 40 chairs. And we don't have any aisles that are distinctive, because just like that picture under the tent, you couldn't find a processional aisle. Though I think in that picture they showed some chalk marks that they put on the parking lot to kind of direct people into a manner, but it is more complicated that way. So I think again you just kind of go with what your current situation dictates. I'm going to switch back to the share mode. So this was an interesting image. One of the problems with outdoor liturgies is trying to get visuals for people to see. This is actually in the Philippines, where the priest drives around in a truck to the neighborhood and does masses in the neighborhood, so they don't have a huge congregation. But at least he's elevated so you can see. And in a number of images that I've seen of outdoor masses, it's very difficult because they tend not to have a platform out there. They don't tend to have shade out there, and it becomes a little more difficult to consume. I know my sister's parish in Orange County, California, they do outdoor liturgies, and it's about 100 people that come, which is a decent size, but in the Midwest, numbers are pretty small of those returning actually to service. So I did want to look a little bit at outdoor liturgies, and I wanted to show this one, which is a drive-in mass.
We are at the glorious campus of Our Lady of Good Counsel Catholic Parish in Plymouth, Michigan, and this is one of our Sunday parking lot masses. The end of April, the Lord gave us this idea. We're blessed with a huge parking lot, and we could best serve God's people by starting here in the parking lot. So every Sunday we've been doing 3 parking lot masses in the morning.
It's definitely different. It's a welcome change. When you're all around a screen, it was very hard to get our kids to act like it was real Mass. Here they get the same experience of Mass. They see people. They're in a familiar place.
And so they are so grateful to be able to worship in the parking lot. We've had a mom of 8 kids say that she feels so safe being in her car. And so the overwhelming response has been, this has been great. To begin to worship, build momentum here in the parking lot.
So let me kind of throw this out to you, and just one point of clarification. So this is the altar right here, and you can see they've staggered the cars so it creates visual lines actually for it. I happened to attend this service this past Sunday just to see what it was like, and I have to admit it, they had the efficiency of Disneyland. They had parkers literally putting you into your spots. The communion ministers came before the Mass began and took a tally of how many people were in your car. And they actually bring communion in a pyx to every car, so it's protected. Then the lead driver, I guess, is the communion minister by default, and they minister to the people in the car, and then the ministers return and collect all of the pyxes so that they can sanitize them for the next parking lot Mass. So I just found it quite fascinating. So I'm just going to open it back up for what you're seeing. And again, if people have questions about this, it's kind of an interesting idea. Two things I would say, it was 95 degrees and a threat of rain, and being in a car was actually very comforting. And they do sound through FM radio. So you just turn on your radio and you've got the entire music coming in. You can hear the lectors quite well. Visually, it's a little hard to see the priest under a shaded awning there. But other than that, there was a sense of community. I mean, the person next to me, the couple sitting in their car, you could see them. You couldn't see most people really easily, but you did get a sense that you were together with a group of people. And the odd thing I'll just add is even at communion time, people left early. And so it became real obvious as they started driving out. But so even in this scenario, people had their own takes. So let me just kind of open this up. Maybe Johan first from a liturgical, after you were talking about the sense of the virtual, what this means.
Well, one principle that I have been adhering to and that I find consolation in these days is extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures.
Yes.
And both canon law and the general instruction of the Roman Missal, though they suggest that worship should happen within a sacred space, a church, a chapel, an oratory, they do make provision for circumstances that do not allow for that to happen. Example is when a military chaplain celebrates Mass outside for some soldiers in the field. So there is this, it is permissible to do it. And some people are very creative in how they do it. Now, I have not experienced it, this very particular liturgy, but it looks like they're very creative in creating some sense of community. I think what people really miss, what I hear from our community, is that they miss being together. They very much appreciate having a beautiful liturgy produced and on their screen, but they miss interacting with other members of our community. Now, the interaction there is limited, but at least you have a visual connection. You can wave at one another. You can honk at one another. So right. I think a sense of community is gained. So I think there are, would it be my preference? Probably not. Thankfully, we don't have a parking lot, so we can't even think of it. But nevertheless, I think, every community, I think, is trying to do the very best they can, trying to follow health guidelines, church guidelines, and then dealing with their own what they can do and what they cannot do. And I think this is a very creative way of, in extraordinary times, use extraordinary measures.
Good.
Yeah, and I would say from a public health perspective that this is a really, really good example of using a whole lot of strategies to mitigate risk of transmission. And it even allows for people to sing in their cars. I think, in an indoor space, it is just, you cannot design a situation that allows singing safely. Whereas, and most outdoors, like even if you had chairs spread out, it'd be very difficult to design a situation where singing would be appropriate. This actually does allow people to sing in their cars with their families safely.
So that could be scary, depending on the voices you're listening to, yes.
But what I found interesting about your comments, but both of you mentioned the sense of community that can be fostered in this, and yet our sense that sitting 6 feet apart, either in chairs in a parking lot where you can actually see the person, and or that our comment was that community was difficult to achieve in that situation. So I'm wondering, I mean, just empirically, I would think it would be the opposite, but it does not seem to be that case. So I don't know.
I think, when you're used to going to a church where everybody is seated close together, that's sort of the expectation that you come with. One has no expectation when going to a newly created drive-in mass. Yeah. And so the little connection that one can create that way actually feels like a great connection, I presume.
That's a great point.
In some ways, the novelty of it allows something to be kind of contemplated that way. It was interesting. The greeters, and now they didn't do any kind of contact information, which is probably problematic because if there were, in my case, the Eucharistic minister forgot to put her mask on when she was distributing the pyx. And I realized as soon as I grabbed it, I'm like, oh my God, this could be contagious. So as soon as she left, I had my bottle of Purell, and I'm just like cleaning quickly for like 40 minutes, to make sure, wiping down the entire car, steering wheel, and everything else, just because I was panicked at that point. But that was the one little glitch I noticed. But what was nice is that it didn't, you didn't feel like you had to go through those protocols, those questions, and stuff. And it's hard because a lot of churches have worked diligently to try to figure out how to greet people, in our kind of current culture where everyone is disassociated from other people, the sense of people arriving and coming together and building community. But this allowed it. Johan?
What we have discovered, people who come have to go through this health protocol. Their temperature is taken, they have to answer questions, and the people who actually welcome our guests, our congregation, wear face masks, they wear face shields, they wear a special smock. And so what we have discovered is that you can't see the ministers of hospitality smile through their masks and behind there. So we have to be extra outgoing and welcoming to make sure that people don't think they're going to a clinic or, to another unpleasant place, but that they actually go to church. So we have to overcompensate, I think, in terms of our sense of welcome when we require these health protocols.
And just a question, is there any reason to wear a face shield if you're wearing a mask, Michael? That kind of came up actually in a discussion on classrooms, but I'm thinking, does that do any good?
Well, so it certainly isn't an extra precaution. So if somebody is going to be in front of a lot of people who are expelling potential aerosols, then it's a good additional precaution to put them in front of. Most of us are not in front of that regular expulsion on a regular basis. So like Johan describing the people who are doing regular temperature checks, if you're close enough to have to use those temperature guns and ask questions from a whole lot of people, then a face shield is probably a very good idea.
Good.
We also found that it gives the people who do that work a sense of safety.
That's a good point.
Which is important, I think.
Yeah. Going back to an earlier question or comment that came up, when the presider is over 65 or 60, should the presider actually do communion, or should they even process through the church? Again, in one of our churches, we've decided not to take the risk, but does that, from a public health standpoint first, and then from a liturgical standpoint?
Yeah, and so just to kind of comment that there's nothing magical about the age 65. And so, if somebody is 66, they shouldn't do it. 64, they should do it. Or like a really healthy 67-year-old is much, if you have the choice between that person and a 60-year-old who is a diabetic and has congestive heart, like all of those things, you need to figure out and so the question that I would ask is, who is the person who is least at risk for severe disease within our potential ministers, and ask if they are comfortable offering communion, and that's the way that I would proceed. So if that's the priest who falls into that category of the person least at risk, great. If it's somebody else, that's what I would recommend.
Okay. And Johan, any sense from a liturgical standpoint if the priest doesn't process in or?
Yeah, sadly, I mean, we are, as a church, a processing church. Yeah. And here at the Basilica, we are really a processing church. As you have witnessed, Gilbert, when we do processions...
Yes, they're big.
Yeah, they're big. And so for us to make the decision not to have any processions was a very difficult decision. So when we have people present for the liturgy, we do not have a procession, at least not a procession from the entrance of the church. So the ministers basically, everybody who ministers in the church stays in the sanctuary until at the time of communion, a younger member of our staff distributes Holy Communion. And by the way, some dioceses have established a directive that priests 65 or over should better not distribute Holy Communion. So.
Oh, interesting. There was one church that I'd heard of, but I haven't gotten confirmation, where the priest is actually celebrating the liturgy in a small chapel, and they're actually live streaming it into the church where the congregation is, for this very reason, because he's very up in age and health reasons. And so the virtual and the real Mass start to come together in a kind of an unusual way. We did have a question about other means of communion, and I'm going to kind of switch us back to a communion. Now, this one is after a liturgy. They are doing communion in the parking lot as a drive-up communion with actually 2 stations. So the first station has the pastor, who is just kind of having spiritual conversation with people, because what other churches began to realize is that people really wanted to just talk a little bit, and then they wanted to receive communion. So the pastor waits at the station 1 or window 1, receives, has the conversation, and then he switches to, they move up to the actual communion. So let me just run this real quick. And you can see now, the reason the umbrella is there is actually for rain. It wasn't anything liturgical, though that possibly could be needed, but in this case it was rain.
All right, don't run me over.
So let me again bring this back. Any thoughts on this? And again, part of their thinking was if they were to take communion out to the homes, which you're allowed to do, at least in the Detroit Archdiocese, this becomes almost a safer manner. So the people watching the virtual liturgy live streamed then come to communion after the liturgy is over, and then there's this kind of drive-in situation.
Well, I would say, again, this is an extraordinary measure in extraordinary times. Had we had this conversation 6 months ago, I would probably react very differently than I do today. One thought about the umbrella, maybe because of the rain, but what strikes me is, if anyone who has been to papal Mass outside of St. Peter's, the communion stations are indicated by yellow and white striped papal color umbrellas. So they have a practical reason that they indicate to the masses where Holy Communion is being distributed. But they also have an honorific reason to indicate a sort of a sacred realm where the Blessed Sacrament is present. It doesn't always work so well, as people are still, fighting to get there. But I was thinking of that concept when seeing the umbrella. Now, there may be a practical reason to it there, that it's raining, but I think there's also an honorific reason to it, creating some sense of sacred in this parking lot where there is nothing really sacred. But then what I find striking is that as the minister goes to the other side of the car, he says, "Oh, do not follow me." Well, the practicality of the rain not falling on the host is now taken away, but also the sense of creating sacred. This is not like I was on a trip once with some friends, and we went to a winery for tasting. And had lunch there, and after lunch it was raining. We wanted to visit the grounds, and as soon as one of my friends set foot outside in the rain, one of the attendants from the winery opened an umbrella and walked everywhere where he went to take pictures. That's not what this is. This has nothing to do with the person distributing Holy Communion. So he should feel okay that the umbrella is above him, because it's for the Blessed Sacrament. This is not about him. It's about the Blessed Sacrament.
Right.
And I think that also kind of gets to, from a public health perspective, that's the way I was looking at it. And I'm always looking at where the potential places of mistake and error from the plan that we have built about. And so the other piece that I would just comment on is training our ministers for this new reality. And one of the pieces of training that I would kind of give to that Eucharistic minister as a point of feedback is don't jog around a car, both in terms of like liturgically, it's just kind of process, but then also like when you're coming to a stop and then wanting to give somebody communion, like you're much less likely to kind of fumble around a little bit. So just kind of getting our ministers to kind of take in this new reality and do it as well as possible, I think would be helpful from both a liturgical and a public health point of view.
Now, one thing that they do, and it wasn't in the video, is they actually do the Lord's Prayer, and then they raise the host and behold the Lamb of God. So there is a liturgical action like you would if you were visiting the sick in doing this. So there is that part that I cropped out of the video, but it does slow them down. And I think, going to your point, Michael, it's that slowing down and thinking of this reverently so that you're not quickly making a mistake somewhere.
I think we will, if this continues, we will need to find a way to ritualize these unritual moments.
Right.
Because when we're in church, the church dictates to us a certain kind of behavior by virtue of the space, the sacrality, the art that is around us. But when we're in a parking lot, nothing dictates ritual behavior. But if we're going to distribute Holy Communion, we need to engage in ritual behavior that is respectful of the act that we are doing. And, so stepping out of this by running around the car or engaging in chit chat with the persons in the car, I think that needs to be eliminated. It's actually, you're processing up to receive Holy Communion. It's a ritual and ritualized act. And I think we'll discover that more and more as we do this.
Well, and it was interesting because in talking to the pastor about this, that was the reason why, for lack of a better phrase, window one was a chance for them to connect with the pastor. And in another church, they found that when the pastor was holding the ciborium, the chit chat was really awkward. It was just not becoming for that very reason. So having a little bit of spiritual conversation and then moving to this is one way. And again, I think part of this whole forum is trying to think like, how do you begin to fine tune some of these so that you can develop them? And not every diocese is going to go for this. I have to admit, I think here in Detroit, they've allowed some experimentation, just like they had to, I guess, after Vatican II, to see what's working. How do you hold some of these principles and develop them, so that they can do it safely. Michael, is there any concern about someone, at one point he reaches in to give communion, but it isn't that, they're not 6 feet apart. Now he's got a mask on, they have a mask on. But the interior of the car is probably germ-ridden at that point. Do you have to be careful in a certain way, or?
I mean, certainly you always want to be careful, but there's very, very low likelihood that the kind of aerosol droplets from the car are going to briefly, with that kind of brief encounter, infect somebody with the virus. Now, the key is, and what I wouldn't be so sure about, is that everybody in the car is wearing a mask. If that's not the case, then they need to have some kind of way to indicate from further than 6 feet apart, put on a mask before I come, within arm's length, because you're going to be saying amen to me, presumably. And I don't want to, we can't put our communion ministers at that kind of risk.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've gotten some questions about the notion of outdoor masses, and I know one of the reasons we were focusing on that was for the folks in California who are under the mandate now that they're only allowed to do outdoor masses. But the obvious point is this doesn't work in a lot of places, and especially in Minneapolis where it snows, this will not last very long. So to begin thinking, how do you deal with these situations later on? And that might be part of what we do in our next session next week. And there was also questions. Yes, Johan?
I saw a question about why not engaging in devotions and lighting of candles.
Yes.
Somewhere up. And one of the reasons why we discourage people in the church from engaging in this activity is for the sanitizing of the church after the service. We know where people have sat. We know the path people have taken. We know which doors have been used. So we really know where to concentrate our sanitation. If we invite people to walk about and go to their preferred devotional chapels, and then it becomes a much bigger endeavor. Now we are trying to offer alternatives because we know that devotional life is very important. So in terms of lighting candles, we invite people to, on our website there is a special page for lighting candles. Now it's not a virtual candle. We actually light candles. So at the end of Sunday Mass, we sing the Marian antiphon, right now the Salve Regina, and during that time, we light candles for the intentions of the people who have sent them to us. So when we feel the need to take something away from people, we also try to offer something in return.
Great.
For devotional chapels, devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, we have 2 locations on campus outside with statues of the Blessed Mother. So we can still feed our devotional needs on campus, but not in the same way, of course, as we used to do.
I think that's a great way of kind of blending the virtual world and the tactile world together in a way that might be useful, especially in this time of pandemic. I know we're starting to come towards the end. I'm going to show one more video, and this might be helpful for thinking of what might occur in the future, which would be the notion of how do you blend the virtual and the face-to-face. Now, this is St. Monica's in Santa Monica, and what they're doing is doing a virtual choir because their choir normally would stand behind the altar. There's a choir area that's been set up for them, but it's too close to the presiders. Same thing with the ambo. There really is almost too close, so the the lectures are actually virtual. So let me just show this, and then I think we'll come back to this next week, because it's just fascinating. So the sign is telling you to stand, and people are also watching this virtually. And the music is quite good.
We till the earth, we tend the ground.
And this is what the congregation is saying.
Hope and peace where none is found. In selfless love, God's life abounds. We till the earth, we tend the ground. Where heart and hearts have turned to green, trampling upon the fledgling sea.
And so it's intriguing because part of me just wants to sing along with this, especially since they put the words there. And then when they show the congregation, that you could tell they can't sing because no one's allowed to sing in the churches, but the music is still very moving. And so this whole larger question about what do we do about singing? And again, we're at the 5-minute mark, so I don't want to necessarily go into this in depth, but if there's any just general insights, and I think we would then again bring this back to our discussion next week. So any initial thoughts?
The one thing I would like to say is that St. Monica has been really visionary in terms of using live stream. They've done it for many years, and they're technologically very advanced, more advanced than any other church. So again, I think they've been doing groundbreaking work when it comes to this whole issue of live stream.
And again, I'm happy to discuss it further during our next session. I am wowed by that particular video. It is so well done, and this is, I think, one of the I would say reception of communion and singing are the two places where people feel the kind of angst or existential concern more than any other place. And while I recognize that dimension of our worship is so important, there are few things that are as dangerous as the kind of expulsion that comes from singing in an indoor space. Even if you're wearing a mask, it is just one of the most dangerous things we can do in a faith community gathered indoors. And so while it's really, really difficult to take this position right now, I just don't see how we have any kind of alternative as long as the community spread, meaning the presence of the virus in our community is where it is.
Yeah. And it's a struggle because, again, like I said, every time I listen to that video, I just want to sing along. Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, if I was in the church right now, could I do it or not?
So what we will do once we welcome back people to the church, and, for better or for worse, but we are going to celebrate one liturgy without people present so that we can still provide more music to the people who are at home and invite them to sing along. And then when we celebrate the second Mass that day, it will be without all the music and a much more simple liturgy. So we can talk more about that next week.
Well, again, thank you, Johan, and thank you, Michael, for insights into this. I hope this forum has been helpful for those of you who are involved with liturgy, or those of you who just have an interest in liturgy and wondering what this pandemic is kind of bringing about, which I think is a creative sense of energy of asking, how can we improve what we do from a liturgical standpoint? Because it'll be around at least a year or two. And especially for the elderly who aren't able to engage even in these masses, whether indoor or outdoor, how do we begin to change and improve all of that? So I'll turn it back over to Robert if there's any last comments or any information that we need.